For 7 years, my life had been a quiet void. No calls, no letters, no contact from the family I left behind. I had convinced myself I could find peace far from the betrayal that shattered my world. But that fragile peace crumbled the moment I heard the knock at my door. It was loud, insistent, carrying a sense of urgency that made my stomach churn. When I opened the door, the last person I expected to see was standing there, my daughter. Her expression was a volatile mixture of anger and disdain, her piercing eyes an unflinching reminder of the hatred she must have nursed over the years. She had grown into a young woman, but the sharpness of her gaze was unmistakably that of the teenager I had left behind. "Well, look who decided to become a ghost," she said, her voice steeped in sarcasm. "Did you think you could just disappear and we'd forget about you?" I stood frozen in the doorway, her words slicing open wounds I had worked so hard to bury. My throat tightened, but I finally managed to croak. "Why are you here?" "Why do you think?" she snapped, her voice trembling with fury. "Mom's sick, dying actually. And I need money for college. You might not care about us anymore, but you're still responsible for helping. Or does that concept not exist in your shiny new life?" Her words hit me like a freight train, their weight leaving me momentarily breathless. But instead of responding, I stepped aside, silently inviting her in. She crossed the threshold, her sharp eyes scanning the small apartment I now called home. "This is where you've been hiding?" "Pathetic," she muttered, her bitterness cutting deep. I stayed silent, letting her unleash years of pent-up resentment. 7 years, Dad," she continued, her voice trembling with emotion. 7 years and not a word. "Do you have any idea what Mom and I went through because of you?" Her accusations hung in the air like a storm cloud, oppressive and unrelenting. I remained calm, though her words stung in ways I couldn't describe. "I think you've said enough," I murmured quietly. Her eyes narrowed, her voice rising with defiance. "No, I haven't. You don't get to decide when this ends. You owe me an explanation for abandoning your family." I looked at her, the anger in her gaze a reflection of my own from years ago. "You'll get one," I said evenly. "But it's not the explanation you're expecting." She crossed her arms, her stance rigid, waiting for me to speak. The room felt heavy, weighed down by the silence that followed. 7 years ago, I came home early from work, I began, my voice steady but thick with emotion. "I wanted to surprise your mother. Instead, I was the one who got the surprise." I paused, the memory still vivid, raw, and unforgiving. "I found her in our bedroom with another man. She didn't even try to deny it. She just stood there, looking at me like I was the one intruding." Her expression faltered, a flicker of skepticism crossing her face. "You're lying," she said, though her voice wavered. "I wish I were," I replied, my voice tinged with bitterness. But that wasn't the worst of it. After the affair came to light, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more she hadn't told me. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. I took a DNA test. Her eyes widened, and I could see her mind racing, the pieces beginning to fall into place. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but quickly closed it, her silence urging me to continue. "The results came back a few weeks later," I said, my voice shaking despite my efforts to stay composed. "And they confirmed my worst fear. You're not my biological daughter." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Her reaction was immediate, a mix of shock, anger, and confusion. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's not true. You're lying to me." I reached into a drawer and pulled out a folder I had kept hidden for years, placing it on the table between us. "See for yourself," I said, my voice heavy with resignation. Her hands trembled as she reached for the folder, flipping it open with hesitant fingers. Her eyes scanned the pages, darting back and forth as the truth stared back at her. "No," she repeated, her voice breaking. This can't be real." "It's real," I said softly. "That's why I left. Your mother betrayed me in ways I can't even begin to describe. She let me believe you were mine, let me pour my heart and soul into raising you, all while knowing the truth." Her trembling hands clutched the edge of the table, as though it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Her face paled, and for the first time since she arrived, she looked less like the angry stranger at my door, and more like the little girl I once knew, the one I had tucked into bed every night. the one who had run to me after every scraped knee and bad dream. "Why didn't you say anything?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you tell me the truth back then?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair, the weight of her question pressing down on me. "What good would it have done?" I asked. "You were just a teenager. None of this was your fault." "But you still left," she shot back, her voice cracking as tears welled in her eyes. "You didn't even say goodbye." Her words hit me like a sledgehammer, the guilt I had buried for years clawing its way to the surface. "I left because I didn't know how to stay," I admitted, my voice heavy with regret. "Every time I looked at you, I saw her lie. It wasn't fair to you. But I was broken. I didn't want my anger, my bitterness, to ruin your life too." Her tears spilled over, and though she wiped them away quickly, the rawness in her eyes was undeniable. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. For years, I thought I had braced myself against pain. For years, I told myself I'd made peace with the emptiness left behind by my choices. But hearing her words, seeing the anguish in her eyes, it unraveled every defense I'd built. "Do you know how much it hurt, Dad?" she asked, her voice trembling as her anger dissolved into something far more vulnerable. "Waking up one day and realizing you were gone? Mom told me you didn't care about us anymore, that you couldn't handle being a husband and a father." And I believed her. A lump formed in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't speak. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, not in anger at her, but at myself, at the past, at everything that had spiraled out of control. "I cared," I said softly, my voice barely audible. "More than you'll ever know. But sometimes caring isn't enough. Sometimes the pain, it's just too much to bear." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and raw. For a moment, silence swallowed the room, the weight of unspoken emotions pressing down on both of us. Finally she broke it, her voice cracking as she spoke. "She's dying," she whispered, her tears brimming but refusing to fall. "Whatever she did, she's still my mom. And I still need you. Please help us." Her plea cut through me like a blade. Part of me wanted to reach out, to take her in my arms, and tell her everything would somehow be okay. But another part, the part still scarred by her mother's betrayal, hesitated, caught between the instinct to protect and the weight of my own bitterness. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "But I can't." Her head snapped up, disbelief etched into every line of her face. "You can't? Or you won't?" I met her gaze, my own eyes stinging with unshed tears. "I've carried the weight of your mother's lies for too long. It's time for her to take responsibility for the choices she made. If you want answers, go to her. And if you need help, talk to your real father." The silence that followed was deafening. Her face crumpled under the weight of my words, a mix of anger and heartbreak written across her features. For the first time, she didn't seem to know how to respond. I could see the battle waging within her, the truth I had laid bare colliding with the years of lies she'd been told. Then, just as I thought the silence might stretch forever, the sound of her phone vibrating on the table shattered the stillness. She glanced at it, her tear-streaked face tightening as she wiped her eyes. Reaching for the phone with trembling hands, she read the glowing screen, her expression shifting from confusion to something far more unsettling. She froze. Her entire body went rigid, and the color drained from her face. "Who is it?" I asked, a flicker of concern rising in my chest. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely above a whisper. It's from him." My stomach dropped. "Who?" I asked, stepping closer. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, met mine. "From my real father," she said, her voice shaking as though the words themselves were too heavy to speak. A cold sweat broke across my skin. My heart raced, my mind struggling to catch up with the bombshell she had just dropped. "You're telling me he contacted you?" She nodded slowly, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the screen. I watched, unable to look away, as she read the message aloud, her voice quivering with uncertainty. "I know what you found out. Don't trust him. He's lying to you. I'm not the one you think I am, but I've always loved you. I'll explain everything soon." My blood ran cold. It wasn't the words themselves that shook me. It was the name attached to the message. The name of the man who had been in our lives for years. The man I had trusted. The man I thought I knew. I don't understand, she whispered, her eyes darting back to the phone. What does he mean? What's going on? I stared at her, my heart pounding as a chill settled over me. You're telling me he reached out to you now, after all these years? Her gaze searched mine, desperate for answers, but I had none. My mind reeled, the foundation of everything I thought I knew beginning to crack beneath me. This wasn't just about a betrayal anymore. This was deeper, darker. Something I hadn't even begun to uncover. This isn't just about your mother, I said, my voice laced with a fury I could barely contain. You think she was the only one keeping secrets? The man she was with, your real father. He's been playing us all. He's been hiding something, and I don't know what it is yet. But I swear, I'll find out. Her hands shook as she stared down at her phone, her voice barely a whisper. I need to talk to him, she murmured almost to herself. I need to know the truth. Panic surged through me. I reached out, grabbing her arm. No, I said firmly. Don't go looking for answers from him. You don't know what you're walking into. She jerked her arm free, her eyes blazing with defiance. I'm not a child anymore, Dad. I deserve to know what's going on. Don't I? For a moment I was at a loss. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the cracks in her armor, the confusion and pain she had tried so hard to hide. Her world had been torn apart, and now she was grasping for something, anything, to make sense of it all. I'm not stopping you, I said quietly, my voice heavy with regret. But don't expect me to save you from whatever mess you walk into. You're dealing with people who've been lying to you your entire life. This isn't something you can fix with one conversation. Her face softened for a moment, my words sinking in. But then, with a determined set to her jaw, she picked up her bag. I have to do this, she whispered, her voice trembling. For me. For us. And with that, she turned and walked out the door. It closed behind her with a soft click, but the sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. And as I stood there, staring at the empty space where she had been, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The silence in the apartment was deafening, pressing in on me as I sat motionless in the same chair, staring at the closed door. My mind churned with thoughts of my daughter, of the mess I had let her walk into. I had convinced myself that I'd done the right thing, allowing her to go in search of the truth. But now, as the hours dragged on, doubt seeped into every corner of my resolve. Had I just sent her into a world of lies, betrayal, and danger, one I could no longer shield her from? Time passed in agonizing stillness. I couldn't move, couldn't think of anything but her. The tension in the air was unbearable, suffocating. I stared at the door as though willing it to open, but all that greeted me was the echo of my own restless thoughts. Then finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. I hadn't even heard her footsteps. One moment the room was empty, and the next there she was standing before me. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and wild, her entire body trembling, as though she had just emerged from a nightmare she couldn't escape. Dad, she whispered, her voice unsteady, barely audible. You were right. I shouldn't have gone. Before I could respond, her legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the couch. Her hands gripped the armrest tightly, her knuckles white, as though she were holding on for dear life. The look in her eyes was enough to break me. Whatever she had seen, whatever she had learned, it had shattered her in ways I couldn't have imagined. What happened? I asked, my voice thick with worry. My heart pounded in my chest, and I stepped closer, desperate for answers. What did he say? She struggled to speak, her lips trembling as she searched for the words. I met him, she finally said, her breath catching in her throat. I went to the address he sent me. It wasn't a house, Dad. It was a warehouse. I don't even know how to explain it. The moment I got there, I knew something was wrong. It felt like a trap. My stomach sank. The warning bells in my head grew louder. But I kept my voice steady, trying not to let my fear show. You didn't go inside, did you? She nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. I did. He was waiting for me. But the moment I walked in, I knew I'd made a mistake. Her voice broke, and she wiped at her face with shaking hands. He started talking about how everything I knew was a lie, about how Mom had manipulated me, how the truth was even worse than I could imagine. I began pacing, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of her words. What truth? What did he tell you? She looked at me, her expression one of pure anguish. He told me he wasn't my father. Not biologically, but he wouldn't say who was. Her voice dropped to a whisper, trembling as she spoke. He said it didn't matter. And then he said something I can't get out of my head. I froze mid-step, dread pooling in my stomach. What did he say? Her gaze locked onto mine, and I could see the fear and uncertainty that had taken hold of her. He said, "You weren't my father either." The room seemed to tilt around me, the words hitting like a physical blow. What? I whispered, my voice hoarse. He said I was just a pawn in some twisted game between two people who used me for their own purposes. And my real father. He said my real father is someone you'd never expect. The blood drained from my face. I couldn't breathe. My entire world seemed to crumble beneath me, the foundations of everything I thought I knew cracking and falling away. What do you mean? I managed to choke out. Who is he? Who's your real father? Her voice was barely above a whisper. He said it was someone close to us. Someone who's been in our lives since before I was born. Someone you'd never suspect. The weight of her words pressed down on me like a crushing force. My mind raced, sifting through every memory, every relationship, every interaction over the years. And then, like a bolt of lightning, realization struck. No, I breathed, my voice shaking. It can't be. Not him. But the look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. My worst fear was true. The man she was referring to, the man who had betrayed me in ways I couldn't fathom, was someone I had trusted, someone I had considered a friend. I staggered backward, my chest tightening as the truth threatened to consume me. This wasn't just a case of infidelity. This was a complete unraveling of my life, of every bond one had held sacred. The betrayal was deeper, darker than I could have imagined. The days that followed were a blur. My daughter stayed with me for a while, both of us trying to process the weight of what we had uncovered. The truth had been revealed, but it didn't erase the years of lies, the pain, the damage that had been done. In the end, I confronted the man, the person who had been the source of so much destruction. His confession came with excuses, with apologies that rang hollow. He claimed he had never meant for things to go so far, but his guilt was undeniable. As for my daughter, she chose a different path. Despite everything, she refused to let the bitterness consume her. She chose to walk away from the toxicity, to start fresh and build a life untainted by the darkness of the past. Months later, I received a call from her. She was at college, thriving in her own way. The scars of the past were still there, but she had found a measure of peace. And for the first time in years, so had I. I stood by the window, looking out at the world. The betrayals, the lies, they no longer defined me. They no longer defined us. The nightmare was over. And though the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, I knew we would find our way. Together.